Well, good morning. Welcome to North Shore. It's so good to see all of you with us this weekend. I want to say hello and welcome to those of you who may be watching or listening online as well. Glad that you're part of our service this weekend. Just a quick update. Later today at 6 p.m. in this room, we're having our January family meeting as a church. And we do this time of year in part to affirm our budget for 2019, but also to celebrate what God has done in the past year and pray about where He's leading. And so if you call North Shore home, or if you're thinking about North Shore being your church home, we would love to invite you to be part of that tonight in this room at 6 o'clock. So just to let you know about that. And again, we're in this series, our third week in this series called Childish Things, because here's the thing. Everybody gets older, but not everybody grows up. It's possible, and it's possible in churches and in the world around us for human beings to become or to get stuck in petty, superficial, selfish, kind of childish ways of thinking and living, and to not actually grow up. In fact, listen to these words written once by the Apostle Paul. 2,000 years ago, he was describing this dynamic in his life. He wrote these words to a church in a city called Corinth. He said, when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. And in other words, there were these patterns of behaviors that just meant followed along with being a child. But when I became a man, I had to put the ways of childhood behind me. In other words, Paul had to intentionally look at, seek out, root out, repent of all the ways that he had been stuck, all the ways where he needed to grow. And here's the thing, if we want to become the women and men that God has made us to be, so do we. So do we. Last weekend, if you were here or you heard the service, we talked about how quick we are to say these four little words, it's not my fault. This idea that it's so easy in life to blame whatever's going wrong in the world or going wrong in our lives on somebody else. It's his fault, it's her fault, it's their fault, it's somebody else's fault, but it's not my fault. In fact, someone came up to me after the service and said, thank you for that message. My wife really needed to hear that. And I thought, yeah, it's one way to think about it. But we have this tendency to want to blame others, to shift the responsibility on someone else. And that becomes one of the primary barriers for maturity in our lives. And if you missed last weekend, I would encourage you to get online or open up the app and listen. Well, this weekend, we're talking about another obstacle, another barrier that we have in order to grow up. There's a psychologist named Dr. John Townsend who tells the story of a young man in a job interview. And he was interviewing for a position for which he was quite well qualified. He had all the right skills and experience. He was a charming and charismatic guy, super bright. He had stellar references. And then he showed up at the company, sat down for what was supposed to be a 40-minute interview with the director of human resources, the HR director at that organization. But at about 20 minutes into the interview, the HR director said, you know, you seem like a really gifted guy and a talented person, but I don't think this is going to be a good fit. I don't think this is going to work out. The young man said, I don't understand. It's only been 20 minutes, and I'm overqualified for this job. I meet all the criteria. If anyone deserves this job, it's me. And the HR director said, yeah, you know, you're a talented guy, but the whole time I've been interviewing, you've been texting on your phone. It's a true story. And so the young man leaves. 2 hours later, the HR director gets an irate phone call about that interview. Anyone guesses who called him? His mom, who called to say, you just don't know how special Junior is, do you? And, you know, can you believe that? And I had to tell her, Mom, you just can't call about job interviews anymore. I mean, I'm my own person now. You just can't make that phone call. And the story is a picture of what's called entitlement. Entitlement. It's this idea that I shouldn't have to take responsibility. I'm kind of exempt from responsibility, actually. Even more so, it's this idea that life kind of owes me something. I'm in a position where I'm owed special treatment. You know, life owes me happiness, or life owes me security, life owes me comfort, life owes me prosperity, life owes me privilege. Why? Because I'm me and I'm special and I deserve it. I recently heard about a survey that was done among business executives who were asked what one word they would use to describe the mindset of 20-somethings in the workforce today. And the number one response was the word entitled. Other research has shown that young people in the workplace think today they deserve more and more pay and promotion, as well as more and more time off and recreation. Sort of an interesting paradox that goes with that, right? And the result is people today are wrestling with what psychologists will call hypomania. And it's this kind of mixture of high anxiety and unrealistic expectations. And I imagine I'm diagnosing some people in the room right now. The sense of like high anxiety, I'm always fretful and worried and wondering if I'm going to get what I need. And unrealistic expectations, like, gosh, I think I deserve more. I think the standard should be higher. I don't see why my life isn't better along than it is. And for people of faith, there's a real kind of deep, dark spiritual side to this. Because what happens in churches today, what happens to people who seriously want to intend to follow Jesus, is we begin to think it's God's job to give us what we feel entitled to. And people will approach their faith, they'll approach God as if God is sort of this divine kind of cosmic vending machine who's there to kind of make sure we get what we need, what we feel we deserve when we need it. Some time ago, I read an article about the most common statements following church services in our day. And you think they'd be on the level of, wow, I felt God move, or I'm so glad that God is good, or I'm so glad for what God did. The most common sentiments from churches today were some of these statements. The room was too cold. The music was too loud. The minister was too old. The seats were too hard. The people were too noisy. The sermon was too long. As if that's even possible, guys, right? I was talking to a small groups pastor at a church who said someone signed up to be in a small group in that church. But they had some pretty specific conditions for the small group they wanted to be part of. They said, we want a group where everyone in the group is between 35 and 40 years old. They're all married with kids in elementary school, preferably private school. And they should all make between $100,000 and $150,000 a year. Because we want to make sure the group works for us. Why? Because we have this entitled spirit, even when it comes to our life with God. My church should work for me. Worship should sound good to me. My small group should perfectly fit me. And friends, this isn't a new thing that's coming up just recently. It goes all the way back to the first human beings. Last week, we looked at that first story of the Bible, the first sin in the Bible and the first response to sin in the Bible, which was that moment of blame and blame shifting. But if you think about that first sin, that first moment, the first wrong in the Bible, God had given the first human beings everything they needed. And he said, I've given you basically everything in my creation for you to use and enjoy except this one tree, this one thing that's not good for you. And what did they do? They went to that one tree and they ate from it. Why? Well, the text says they saw the fruit of that tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom. And they thought, wait a minute here, I deserve those things. I mean, I'm down here kind of slaving away for God in some way. A pleasure, wisdom, a satisfied appetite. God owes me at least that much, right? Heck, the serpent said we would be like God. Isn't that a good thing? It's like getting a trophy just for showing up. And here's the thing. We're still stuck in this cycle of entitlement still today. And what's even more dangerous about this is how we hardly notice it in ourselves. It's easy to spot it in somebody else, isn't it? Oh, you can spot it in their attitude, their behavior. You can kind of sniff it out and you kind of go, gosh, that's just kind of a crummy way to think about life. But it's hard to see it in ourselves. Why? Because we think we're the exception, which just goes to show how deep the entitlement goes. So how do we break the cycle? Well, we need to turn to the life and teaching of Jesus. See, Jesus knew this way of thinking and all its dangers. In fact, in his day, the religious leaders in his day felt very entitled, very deserving of their spiritual status in the community and before God. But Jesus didn't see life as a debt to which humanity is owed. He saw life as a gift that's been entrusted to us. And he taught about this numerous times, but perhaps the most clear picture was in a story he told his disciples just days before he was arrested and eventually crucified. It's a story from the Gospel of Matthew, starting in chapter 25, starting in verse 14. You can follow along if you want. Jesus says this about the coming kingdom of heaven, the way of God, the reality of God that's breaking into our world. He says this, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one, he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more, but the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and he hid his master's money. Now pause for a moment. This story, and we'll continue reading in a moment, this story begins with a rather staggering statement. Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven will be like a man who in this case represents God. This man who goes on a journey, but before he does, he calls his servants together. He brings them into a room. He calls them into his presence. And what does he do? He entrusts his wealth to them. If you have a Bible with you or a Bible on your phone, you should highlight, circle that phrase, that word. He entrusted his wealth to them. It's the most crucial detail in the story. If you miss this detail, the rest of the story is not going to make sense. He entrusted whose wealth? His wealth to them. And by the way, these are no small amounts of money. Some of you may have a version of the text where it translates that phrase, bags of gold, with the word talent. Talent in that day was worth about 20 years of income for an average day laborer. So what's happening is these servants are given really vast amounts of resources. The first servant receives 5 bags of gold, 5 talents, so 100 years of income. The second servant, 40 years of income. The third, 20 years of income. That's a ton of wealth. But notice, the money is not given because the man owes the servants. The money is given because the man trusts the servants. How cool of a picture is that? That this man would entrust his precious wealth, what he's earned, what he's made, what he deserves, to these servants. It says a lot about God, doesn't it? It tells us at the beginning of the story, and we have to hear this, or again, the story won't make sense, that the man in the story, and thereby God, who the story's about, is good. He's generous. He wants to trust and entrust who he is and what he has to people like you and me. He wants us to experience, he longs for us to experience the joy of living for something bigger than just ourselves. I once heard it put this way: yourself is too small for you to waste your entire life on it. Yourself is too small for you to waste your entire life on it. You're not entitled to anything, but you're entrusted with so much skills, abilities, relationships, intellect, intelligence, resources, time, energy. You've been entrusted. The man entrusted his wealth to them, but not evenly. Anyone else notice that little detail? Like you get 5, you get 2, you get 1, and you wonder kind of what's everybody thinking? Are they comparing to each other? And why did he get 5 and I got 1? He gave each to his own ability, he says. And at first glance, if you think about it, it doesn't appear to be very fair. I mean, for the fair-minded person, the first reaction is, gosh, 5, 2, 1, gosh, this guy's really not distributing his stuff very evenly. When I was growing up, if my sister ever got anything that I didn't, or vice versa, we'd always respond with the same 3 words: that's not fair. And here's the thing: just because you get older doesn't mean you grow out of that instinct. You grow out of that sentiment. I see someone with nicer stuff. I think to myself, that's not fair. I see someone who's more talented than me. I think to myself, that's not fair. But here's the thing. If we're honest, if we look closely at this part of our souls, really, it's not actually about fairness or equity or justice. It's really usually about entitlement. Question: how many times have you heard someone who got, say, a below-market deal or their rent, or a huge surprise promotion at work, say, gosh, that's unfair? 0, right? Because we're only going to complain that life is unfair if I get 1 bag of gold while somebody else gets 5. But if I get 5 bags of gold, I deserve it. I earned it because it's me, and I'm special, and I'm entitled, right? And it's important just to pause and do a little spiritual audit of your soul right now, because this will help you test, God, where is my heart with you in this? And right now, it's not about condemning or judging what's going on in there, just to get really clear and really aware about where your heart's at. When you have less than someone else, do you feel cheated or envious? When you see someone else get blessed, do you first response celebrate what God's doing in their life? Or does it make you want to kind of complain and grumble? See, the fact is, our hearts are not really concerned with fairness and justice so much as they're concerned with the question, am I getting what I think I deserve? I was talking with someone not too long ago about who was frustrated that she wasn't in a dating relationship. And the reason she said it was so difficult is because God had given her friends all, great relationships or great marriages, and she said it just doesn't seem fair. Now, I didn't get married until I was 38 years old. I was a single adult for about 20 years, so I feel like I carried a little bit of expertise in the subject. So I said, let's put aside everything that's going on in your friend's life for a moment and answer me this question. What has God entrusted to you right now? And she paused. She thought for a moment. She said, well, gosh, I have maybe a little extra time, and I have a real heart for people and for helping others, and I'm pretty good at leading and getting stuff done. And so I said, okay, what do you think God would want to do with all that if he were you? I was laying on the pastor talk like really thick at that point, right? And she said, God would probably use that extra time and abilities to pour into other people. I said, I think you may be onto something. And remember, Jesus was single. Paul was single. There's nothing unholy or incomplete about being single. So she started using that extra time to serve as a leader in her church. And not only did God use her to impact a lot of lives along the way, you know what else happened along the way? Well, she met this amazing Christian man. And he was so cute. Her words, not mine. And the moral of the story is, if you want to date, just serve at your church, okay? Just kidding. Don't. Here's my point. We have to stop obsessing over what's going to make life even and start thinking really seriously about what has God entrusted to me, like right now? Like what am I entrusted with? What's in my hands? What has he placed in my life that I can do something with, regardless of what anybody else has? Which takes us back to Jesus' story. Look at verse 19. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, he gets what had happened. He gets the environment. It was never his. He said, see, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. He's not worried about the 5 that became 10. He's not obsessing over what envy he may have. He's so excited he gets to bring to the master what God had entrusted to him and what he had done with it. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The guy's always in share mode, isn't he? Now, the fact that Jesus repeats the exact same words for servant 1 and servant 2 is really, really important. Because so often we get in this comparison game. But look, this means we are only accountable for what God has entrusted to us. We are only accountable for what God has entrusted to us. God understands that life isn't even. God understands that people are born into different situations with different circumstances, leading to different experiences and opportunities. You are only accountable for what God has entrusted to you. The relationship you're in, the education you have, the job or career that you're managing, the resources you have, the kids that you're raising. We are only responsible for what God has entrusted to us. But there's a part 2 of this statement that's really important. It's we are fully accountable for what God has entrusted to us. I'm not accountable for what someone else has been given and what they do with it, but I am fully accountable for every ounce of what God has entrusted to me. Servant 1 wasn't accountable for what servant 2 did with this money, but he was fully accountable for what he did. You see, there will be a day when the true owner of all of our stuff comes back. And he won't just ask you, did you go to church on the weekend? Did you read your Bible faithfully? Were you part of a small group? He's going to say something like, I entrusted you with a marriage. What did you do with it? I entrusted you with a great education. How did you steward it? I entrusted you with financial resources that you could use in so many different ways. How did you use them? Ever thought about how you're going to answer questions like that? Which brings us to the 3rd servant, verse 24. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. Whole different dynamic going on with this servant, isn't it? And we can't go back and hear the tone of his response, but it's clear in some way he's holding God, he's holding the man accountable for his own choices. He's basically saying, I wouldn't have done this if you weren't such a demanding person, if you didn't have such high expectations, if you weren't so greedy with what belongs to you. In other words, I did what I did because of who I think you are. Anyone else ever think that about God? And the master replied, and this gets really serious. You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown or gathered where I have not scattered seed? Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the banker so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. In other words, God's not admitting that he's this kind of person, but he's saying, if you actually thought that, this is what you would have done. I'm kind of calling you out. And then he said, so take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags, for whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, before you get too turned up on that last line, that doesn't mean that if you've ever been lazy, God's going to send you to hell. But the severity of this conclusion of the story is meant to wake us up, to startle us, to rattle our cage a little bit. Because we can tend to live like servant 3 and not be aware of it. We can be driven by the sense of entitlement for what we think we want, where we feel wronged when we don't feel like things are even. We tend to respond in those situations often by being lazy and more irresponsible. People will say things like, well, I don't think I'm that rich, so it's okay that I mismanage my money. People will say things like, well, I don't have a relationship, so it's okay if I'm reckless with my sexuality. People will say things like, well, I didn't get the promotion I deserved at work, so it's okay that I act unethically in my dealings at the office. All the while blaming God for being hard and stingy and withholding because we feel we're entitled to something better. To which Jesus would respond, God is not accountable to you to make life even. You are accountable to God for whatever he's entrusted to you. God is not accountable to you to make life even. You are accountable to God for whatever he's entrusted to you, whether a lot or a little. And here's the thing, God doesn't take lightly what he's entrusted to you. God doesn't think your one bag of gold is anything less than an opportunity to make an eternal difference in his name. But instead, so often we settle for a short-sighted, comfort-driven, life owes me more, I deserve better kind of existence, don't we? You know, it's interesting. Most people will think of sin in terms of wrong things that people do. But in the story, we see that sin is also right things people don't do. The way we don't invest in others, the way we don't share what we have, the way we don't steward and use what we've been entrusted for God's name. And here's the thing, those kind of sins are no less offensive to God and no less damaging to our soul. No less. So what do we do? How do we get out of this entitlement trap? 2 things that you can take with you this week. First, you need to take responsibility for what God has entrusted to you. Each of us, we need to look real hard and take real responsibility for what God has entrusted to us. Whether it amounts to 5 bags or 2 or 1, here's the thing. It doesn't belong to you. It's God's. It's all on loan. All of it. I was working on this message this week and I couldn't find a certain book that I wanted to use. And then I remember that I had loaned this book to somebody else. And my first thought was, well, that's what I get for sharing. You know, I should have just kept my own book on entitlement. It's my book on entitlement. People can get their own book on entitlement. It's not my book on entitlement. It's God's. Just like it's not my skills of my own to write that sermon out. It's God's. Just like it's not my money in my wallet. It's God's. Which means the question is not, what are you missing out on in life? The question is, what are you doing with what you have? And if you have a lot, if you're more of a 5 bags of gold kind of person, You better step it up. Jesus says, to whom much is given, much is required. What are you doing with all that? And if you just have a little, if you think of yourself as a one-bag person, you better not get caught up comparing yourself with those who have more and wilting away in comparison or fear or insecurity and bearing away what you have for the kingdom. This weekend, we remember the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King once gave a sermon about how every human being has been entrusted with so much, and our job is to use it as well as we can for God's glory. He said these remarkable words. He said, if a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted or Beethoven composed music or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. If you've been entrusted with the ability to teach, teach with surpassing joy and goodness. If you've been entrusted with amazing data entry skills, enter data as if it's a great masterpiece before God. If you've been entrusted with financial resources, you can't take them with you. Make a difference that's eternal in this life. The Apostle Paul put it this way, whatever you do, work with it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. That's whose stuff it is. That's who's going to come one day, look you in the eye and say, okay, friend, what did you do? How did you use it? We are called to take responsibility for what God has entrusted to us. And if you're curious about where he may be calling you to take responsibility, I got a hint for you. It's in that place in your life right now where you know you're avoiding it. And we all have one. This week I read about someone who drove into a parked car, and the driver who drove the car into that parked car didn't want to get his insurance involved, so he asked the other guy if he would get his own estimate and kind of take care of it himself, and the guy replied, that means I have to take time off my work and get my own rental car. That's a lot for me to do when you hit me. And the driver at fault said, well, that's the least you could do. I mean, you were, after all, waiting there for my car to hit you. I don't know if it's a true story or not, but it points to this idea that we all want to kind of shirk responsibility. But God is calling each of us to take responsibility for what he's entrusted to us. That's the first task. Here's the second. Equally important, you need to remember that God is always generous. God is always, always generous. The kingdom of heaven is what? It's like a man who did what? First line of the story, entrusted all of his stuff to people like you and me. Friends, this is not about a God who takes for himself what he thinks he deserves. It's about a God who gives to us what we could never deserve. Joy, life, relationship, meaning, significance, even grace for all the wrongs we've done. You see, the bad news of this message is that life isn't fair. The good news is God isn't either. He is way too generous for that. A friend of mine told me the story about a guy who was newly married early in his career and struggling with financial debt, and he would give in church, but he was always doing so kind of with a grudging spirit. He would say things like, I hate hearing all those God stories about how when people step out in faith and God takes care of them, because God never does that in my life. And then something unexpected happened. A distant relative in his family had an estate sale, and he ended up getting enough money not only to pay off his debts, but have all this left over. And he said, well, that's just great. I've never liked God stories, but now, dang it, I've got one of them. Maybe you've been living with kind of a begrudging, entitled spirit. Maybe you feel like God's never given you that God story because it never happens to you. Maybe you've got the wrong picture of God. See, friends, the third servant in the story did what he did because he had a wrong picture of God. Master, I knew you were a hard man, he said. Pretty astounding words about someone who'd only been so generous. But isn't that how we often think about God, as greedy or stingy or cruel or mean? You see, the choices we make don't just reveal our own character, they reveal what we think about God's character, don't they? And the tragedy of this story is not just that third servant missed out in his life. He robbed every person he met along the way. He robbed every person he met along the way from seeing the work of God in and through him. Why? because he decided that God's investment in him was too small to make any difference or too insignificant for God to use it. And I just want to let that sink in, and maybe that's you this morning. That you've been thinking, whatever God's given me, it's too small to make any difference, or it's too insignificant for God to use it. Both lies. Maybe underneath all that entitlement and arrogance in our day, maybe most of it's just fear and insecurity, right? Well, there's only one way out of fear and insecurity, and it's not trying to get more of what you think you deserve. It's not just getting a trophy for showing up. It's making a commitment to say, God, I'm not going to bury what you've given and entrusted to me. I'm going to invest. I'm going to serve. I'm going to share. I'm going to give, because there was a man who entrusted his entire wealth to people like you and like me. Why? So that we could have a God story. And you can start today. You can start today. In the late 1950s, there was a group of people who wanted to start a church on the northeast side of Lake Washington. It was considered at that time to be a prime area for potential growth, right? Of course. So they found a 3.5-acre parcel in North Kirkland, and they needed $4,000 to buy it. So they put an ad in a church newsletter, and a man named Val Anderson saw that ad. At the time Val worked at Boeing, he made at the time $2 an hour. But here's the thing. Val never felt entitled to that money. He always knew he was just entrusted to him. And when he saw that ad, he thought, I can do something. And so he bought that land so that a church could be planted. And not just any church, this church on this land, which, by the way, is now worth a little more than $4,000, you think? Val passed away last month. The story is in the program this weekend if you want to read more about it. I had the chance to talk to him just a few times, but I could tell from my interactions with him he was super special. And his influence continues on. Every time people come onto this campus, for whatever reason, his influence continues. But the greatest moment of his life didn't come in this life. It came after his last breath, when finally he met the God who had entrusted all of that to him. And I can just imagine Val's face lighting up when he finally heard those amazing words, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Come and share your master's happiness." Friends, we are not entitled to anything, but we have been entrusted with so much. So who do you think owes who? Who do you think owes who? We're going to close a little differently today. I'm going to invite Brandon to come back out for a moment to close us in a little moment of song. And if you'd stand. And instead of me closing in prayer and having you bow your heads and close your eyes, we're going to close with these words from this little song. Most of you will recognize it as a moment where we're going to conclude with words about how God has entrusted so much to us. Because so often when we pray, we start with these words, God give, God give, God give. But here's the thing, God has given you so much. So right now, we're going to close with these words of prayer that start with these words, God, take. Take who I am and what you've given me and how you've entrusted me with so much. Take and use it. Take and mold it. Take and make it more than you would. These are going to be our prayer. And after this song, we're going to close and you can go. So.
Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. Let them flow in ceaseless praise. Sing, take my love. Take my love, my Lord, I pour at thy feet its treasure store. Take myself and I will be ever only all Lord Jesus, that is our prayer. We thank you that we're not entitled to anything, but because you are so generous and so good, we get the new life. We get the power over sin and death. God, we get to be in relationship with you. We thank you for your generosity today. We worship you in your name. Amen.